It's a very pleasant June 4th, 2021 evening in the village of Champlain, and we're about to enter the Champlain Meeting House to listen to a presentation by Mark Barie, and hopefully we'll have a moment to talk to Mark before the presentation begins. We are in the presence of the award-winning author, Mr. Mark Barie, and I got you posted so that your white hair is blending in with the white building behind us.
Thank you, I think.
So he's not bald, he has some hair up there.
I still have hair.
So, you're no longer a Champlain resident, a lifetime Champlain resident, until how long ago?
I moved down to Florida about a little over 6 years ago. Been
6
down there as a
years, wow.
full-time resident, but I come back to the North Country often.
Well, you've got a...
So give me some credit.
You got at least one kid up here.
Yes, and a grandchild and a wonderful son-in-law. But my others have moved. I've got one in Tampa and I've got two in Indianapolis now. So I go all over the country. Happens.
They're trying to get away from you.
Yes. Yeah, the airlines appreciate it.
So, don't you have a baby on the way?
We have two actually. Alexandra
way?
is expecting, her name is Lucy, expecting Lucy probably at the end of September. And then Oliver and his wife Sierra are expecting a boy at the end of November. So by the end of this calendar year, God willing, I will have 5 grandchildren.
Wow.
And 3 of them will be Barries and 2 will be Ashlines. So the bloodline continues. The North Country can mourn that, but the bloodline continues.
Okay, yeah, you had a fairly large family. You grew up in a relatively small house there on Route 9 in Champlain. It must have been very friendly in that house. How many brothers did you have?
I have 7 brothers
sister?
and 1 sister, and I was just talking to my mother, who's going to be 91 years old this August, and her favorite line is when I asked her why she had 9 kids, she said, well, your father and I discussed it before we got married, and we agreed on somewhere between 3 and 5. But she said, your father was never good at math.
Well, especially if you're one of the last ones after the 3 or 5, you're glad that he made those decisions.
Well, I was in the dead center. I was an unexpected twin. I have a twin brother.
Oh, really?
So I was 8 minutes later.
Not
and
identical,
the doctor said, no, I'm the good-looking one.
Thank God.
And the doctor told my mother, hang on, Hazel, there's another one in there. And that was me. I was the bonus baby.
Oh,
yeah.
Back then they weren't getting sonograms and all that good stuff.
Nowadays they can tell you how long the eyelashes
Yeah.
are on an unborn child.
Yeah.
But back then it was
They didn't even
much
hear your
more aggressive.
heartbeat? They didn't hear your heartbeat or anything?
My mother insisted that her child was kicking on both sides simultaneously. The doctor suggested that perhaps she was imagining things.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm part of her imagination.
I won't mention what kind of an imagination she had,
Yeah,
but
right.
we'll let it go at that. So you were up here, you did a lot of history books, and not a lot, but you did several history books, including one on the canal boats right here
That's
in
correct.
beautiful downtown Champlain. And of course you started off with a favorite priest of ours.
I
Maurice
did
Boucher
a
was your
biography of Father
That was your
Boucher.
first endeavor,
Yeah.
as I recall.
And Christine and I collaborated on 2 local history books, Crossing the Line, which was the history of the border, and then the Champlain Canal book was also a collaboration, and that was quite a hit here in Champlain. A lot of Champlainers didn't know there was a thriving boat industry here years ago. And then the fourth book and second biography was your fault, the President of Plattsburgh, the biography, the only biography of Smith Weed. And I continue to sell all of those books.
Really?
Yeah, people still ask for them.
Yeah, you were telling us who you were going to do a whole bunch of people that have chapters on all of them. I said, make sure you include Smith Weed. You said, who?
Smith Who, it's right in the introduction. But after 2 biographies and 2 local history books, I grew tired of footnotes. And so then I took a splurge, if you will. Christine walked into the living room, as I tell this crowd tonight, one day and announced that an ancestor that fought in the Civil War. And one thing led to another, and so I wrote my first in what would turn out to be a trilogy on love and war, War Calls, Love Cries. It got a couple of awards, which stunned me because I thought all of my relatives and family were just being polite when they told me they enjoyed the book. And that led to the second book, which was just published, which is about the Revolutionary War. And right now I'm in about 55,000 words into the 3rd book in the trilogy. And this one I think you'll enjoy. It's about the Battle of Plattsburgh.
I've heard of that.
A tomboy named Charlotte, who becomes Charlie, disguises herself a boy and fights on McDonough's flagship, the Saratoga, during the Battle of Plattsburgh. So it's kind of back home. I really like it. Having fun.
Okay, so you obviously have to do a lot of research because I'm sure there's a lot of checkers when you do these things? And
Well, that is why this presentation is happening tonight. I've done this presentation probably 50 or 60 times around the state of Florida and a little bit in upstate New York. Because before you can even write the first word in a historical fiction book, you'll probably read anywhere from 35 to 50 books, dozens of articles, take copious notes. And in that process of researching this current book, Sister Margarita and the Captain, I came up with this presentation, which I've called the 7 Facts About the Revolutionary War That Will Amaze You. And they amazed me when I discovered them. So my 20-minute presentation is about that tonight. I'll do some questions and answers. I bought a bunch of signed books in case anybody feels like buying one. But this is nice to be back home. I've done this all over Florida, as I said, but this is a very special night for me. I get to come back to my hometown.
yeah, now hopefully there'll be more people viewing than there will be here tonight. We're going to have a packed house in there, but on the internet, on the World Wide Web, how do people get a hold of you if they're interested in
It's
getting
pretty easy. It's markbarie.com. That's my website. I get a lot of visitors.
MarkBarie.com. Not everybody knows how to spell Barrie.
Yeah,
or Mark with a C or a K.
I should hire you as my PR guy. Barrie is spelled B-A-R-I-E. Mark is spelled M-A-R-K. So it's MARKBARIE.com. Phone number's there. Address is there. You can also Google me, and I unfortunately come up about 5 or 6 pages long for all of my checkered past, good and bad. But it's pretty easy to find me. Yeah, the rest records, everything else. So yeah, I would love to hear
And
from anybody. I've got a
Facebook?
Facebook page too. MLB Publishing is the business page. Just Mark Barie award-winning author is the personal page. And I've got a lot of Facebook friends. I think they're numbering well into the hundreds now. And so I love to hear from anybody. So I hope they call or contact me.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago I go to the mail and there's this package there from MLB Publishing. I said, what is Major League Baseball sending me here? I didn't order this.
You told me you were going to run to the post office box to get my book. Did you lie? You just walked?
Well, I ran for about 4 or 5 days and it hadn't come yet. So,
Oh, I see.
so then this Major League Baseball publication shows up, MLB. And
I'm going to start a lottery as to when you have the time to read it, because as I said earlier,
I'm
you've
about
got to be...
2/3 through right now.
Are you really? I'm impressed. My son-in-law, whose sixth great-grandfather, Eric Ashline's sixth great-grandfather, inspired this book, just finished it this morning. He's had it for about 6 months.
She felt obliged to finish it.
Yes, he did. He did, or I was going to steal my daughter back. And my grandchildren.
Your grandchildren. All right, we're about 10 minutes before game time here, so...
Thank you again for coming, Calvin.
Yeah,
Appreciate
we're
it.
looking forward to this.
I, with the risk of sounding gratuitous, I still feel, as I said, I think in one of my books, you are the historian of record here in the Northern Tier, and but for you, the history of the North Country would be a deep, dark, black box for a lot of people. But thanks to you, many people know our history, and we're all the better for it.
Well, I feel lucky that I've had the opportunity to point the camera at so many things.
Well, you certainly didn't do it for the money.
Yeah, that's for darn sure. And
But we're
fact,
grateful.
in 3 days, it'll be 38 years.
Has it really?
Yeah.
38 years?
Yeah. So.
Wow, I just celebrated my anniversary, 33rd anniversary, a couple days ago. So you're really old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is over half my life.
There we go.
It's
There
over
you go.
half my life.
Well, thank you again. Appreciate it.
All right. Mark Barie, award-winning author, and he's available there on Facebook or on the website. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Calvin. Appreciate it.
First of all, I'm Janet McFetridge, and I own the
Did I write that
Meeting
down?
House. No.
Oh.
She knew that part. Are you doing an introduction for me? No, that's good. Our guest today is an award-winning author, originally from upstate New York. Mark and his wife Christine have been living year-round in, do you say Sebring? Sebring, Florida, for the past 6 years. His first novel, a Civil War love story, garnered national attention as a finalist in the prestigious Eric Hoffer Book Awards. The book was also awarded a gold medal for historical fiction by the Florida Authors and Publishers Association. Mark's latest novel is about a nun who leaves the convent and ends up spying for George Washington. As a result of writing Sister Marguerite and the Captain, or I would say the Captain, Mark has assembled a presentation entitled 7 Amazing Facts About the Revolutionary War That Will Amaze You. Please welcome Mark Barie.
There you go. Yeah, right.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I'm humbled and honored that so many of you would take the time from your busy day to join me this evening. I hope I keep you interested and you don't fall asleep on me. I do want to make, before I go any further, a personal observation. There's someone who is not here this evening, and yet his presence fills the room. Many years ago, I'll tell you how old I was on the Board of Trustees at Trent Community College, and Clark Hurdick and I sat on opposite sides of the table. We were negotiating a contract between the college and the teaching staff back then. And that was the first time I think I even met Clark. And in all my years of negotiating on behalf of public sector unions, I did that for several years, I had never met a man who was nicer, or more polite, or more professional, or more honest, I'm not picking on unions, than Clark Hurdick. He was a first-class member of our Clinton Community College family. And Janet, I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody here, we miss him. And he was, like you are, a great part of this community, and he'll always be that way. And so we thank you for all you've done, and we appreciate it. Thank you. Before I begin my formal remarks, I want to introduce my sweetheart back there, Christine Messine, who is with me. She is an expert genealogist, and years ago, she walked into my living room and announced that one of my ancestors fought in the Civil War. And I was pretty proud of that, and one thing led to another. I did some research, and my first book was born, War Calls, Love Cries. And you know, when you write a book, and we had collaborated on several local history books, I've written 2 biographies here in the Champlain, Plattsburgh area, and I got tired of footnotes, so it was quite a thing for me to write a novel. Thanks to Christine, I did a lot of research on that. She helped me with it, and the book was born. And when you write a book, all your friends and relatives will just say it's great. I didn't believe any of them. And then I won a couple of awards, and I said, oh wow, maybe I'm a real author. I still don't feel like I'm a real author. I feel like more like an imposter, you know. But I've been having fun ever since. I found out that man does not live by golf alone. And since then, Christine has found out that I'm going to read the card here, my 5th great-grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War. So I am a son of the American Revolution. In fact, my application is pending. His name was Julian Belanger, and my 4th great-grandfather fought in the War of 1812, which is not coincidentally the subject of my next book, The Battle of Plattsburgh, as a matter of fact. So that'll be a lot of fun reading that. But the inspiration for this book, which is up on the floor.
Nice
Yeah, nice, thank you. The inspiration for this book is right over there. Eric Ashline is my son-in-law, and his 6th great-grandfather, along with my ancestor in the Revolutionary War, and 5th, excuse me, 5th. They all served in the same regiment. Moses Hazen recruited a bunch of Canadians just across the border. He was a brigadier general from Massachusetts. He recruited a bunch of them. And Eric actually has 2 ancestors, both grandfathers that fought in the Revolutionary War. And they were all in the same group, same regiment. And when I found that out, I started researching his great-grandfather, or 5th great-grandfather. This guy was famous. His name was Antoine Poulain. And you can read about him. You can Google his name and read 5 or 6 pages on Google about Antoine Poulain. So I've been true to the history, but I changed his name because I gave him a girlfriend, I gave him kids, I did a lot of stuff to him. I had him wounded in battle. You got to make it interesting. But when you write historical fiction, you're loyal to the history, you're accurate to the history, but the personal stuff you can make it up. That's why they call it historical fiction. But I should explain that as a result of writing a book like this, you might go, I was telling Calvin earlier, you might go through 35 to 50 books ahead of time before you even write your first word, and read dozens and dozens of articles. And that's the basis for your book. But as a result of doing all that research, I came across all sorts of trivia and tidbits and anecdotes that I thought were very, very interesting, and hence this presentation, which is 7 facts about the American Revolutionary War that may amaze you. So, now unfortunately for you folks, you're going to have to work to get all this presentation out. I'm going to ask you some questions, and we'll see how good you are. And you're not allowed to answer unless they get because you know that. Yeah, you're going to whisper the answers. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and if you know the answers, fine. If you don't, just guess. That's what I used to do in high school. I got all the way through high school that way. So, who knows the difference between a pirate and a privateer? Who knows the difference between a pirate? You know those guys that I could use that eye patch right now. A pirate and a privateer. Tell me the difference. Okay, Eric, tell them the truth.
Kind of remember. The pirate steals the money. And the privateer is the one who holds money. They're like the treasurer, I take it?
Well, they both steal the money, but the pirates are out working for themselves. Privateers actually are sanctioned by a government. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, they issued these, what they call letters of marque, not M-A-R-K, but M-A-R-Q-U-E, and that authorized whoever that was with their ship, and they had to post a bond because they had rules to follow, and the bond was quite substantial, but they were authorized by the United States Congress at the time to prey on British shipping, whether it was merchant ships or warships or whatever it happens to be. And if you recall, Great Britain had the biggest and the most powerful navy in the history of the world, and George Washington had nothing. And so he was an instant fan of this privateering. In fact, if you do a little bit of research, you find out that during the Revolutionary War, 1,700 letters of marque were actually issued. And so he and Congress backed this. In fact, at one point, George Washington recruited some people and some ships from Massachusetts, had his own little navy, about 7 or 8. And one of the most popular spots for these privateers to work was just off the coast of Florida, where I now live. And they preyed on British shipping. And they did some significant damage. For example, the Hannah, which captured a British ordnance vessel, got 2,000 muskets, 31 tons of musket shots, about 100,000 flints, so it paid off. George Washington's so-called borrowed fleet captured a total of 55 prizes, which is what they called them back then, 55 ships over the course of the Revolutionary War. And they did some serious damage. Back then they did about, I think it was $2 million worth of damage. Today it would be worth well over $100 million. So they did some significant damage. But my favorite story was the one I was reading about, was that the British ship Hope was captured. I love the name of that ship too, Hope. The reason it was called Hope was that it contained 26,500 gallons of rum. And the Americans captured it, so I decided I should have been a privateer rather than rum. But actually, in all seriousness, Thomas Jefferson said this. I just found this quote the other day. He said, "Privateering is the most merciful part of war, for it damages the enemy by capturing property rather than by destroying life." I thought that was kind of nice. So, okay, now everyone here is still confused and concerned and angry about COVID-19. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm wondering, so what do they do with the people on the ships?
Well, actually, I should mention that. It works both ways. The people on the ships were usually, if it was the British, they were generally released, captured for a little while, but they just wanted the merchandise. But if you were a privateer and you got caught by the British, you were not treated nearly so well. In fact, you were not even treated like a POW. Most privateers, if captured, were put in the hold of a ship and they died there. They were never released. They were never traded for other prisoners. If you were a POW with a uniform on, there was a good chance you'd be treated decently, but not if you were a privateer. Privateers, as far as the British were concerned, were the scum of the earth. But it's interesting because they didn't make victims of the ships unless they were having to defend themselves. They just wanted the merchandise. But you did not want to be a privateer that was captured by the British back then. So, I was going to talk about you because we did the elbow thing. You might be interested to know that before COVID-19, there was another pandemic during the time of George Washington, and it was smallpox. And he was very, very troubled by that. He got it himself, as a matter of fact. He decided to take his brother to the Barbados because his brother had what we now know as tuberculosis, and it was thought that the warmer climate would help with the TB. It didn't. His half-brother died. George Washington, while he was down there, he actually contracted smallpox. Now, if you don't know your biology, let me enhance it a little bit. It was an ugly disease. You were scarred, you had open sores all over your body. In fact, historians have since proven that most of the paintings of George Washington were deliberately changed and covered up his wounds. He had a lot of visible scars. And fast forward quite a few years later, because this happened when he was 19, with the fevers, the chills in the body, so on and so forth. Here he is trying to fight this war against the British, and his troops are being decimated by smallpox. In fact, many historians have argued that we lost the Battle of Quebec because our troops are so depleted as a result of smallpox. Well, there were no vaccines back then. And Washington had two choices: either isolate his men for roughly 30 days, or try to come up with some way to inoculate them. And he did. It was called variolation back then. And at the risk of being a little gruesome, what they would do is they would slice your arm, they would take a piece of thread and soak it in a wound of someone who had smallpox, the pustule matter, put that back into the incision and sew it up. And that beneficiary or victim, depending on your point of view, would contract the smallpox. But it wasn't a bad case. Only about 1% of them died. Most of them in 3 weeks were up and walking around. And that wasn't inconvenient for George Washington, because it would take him about 3 to 4 weeks to get them their guns, their weapons, get them a uniform, train them, so on and so forth. So in pretty quick order, he mandated all of that, that variolation and inoculation for his new recruits. The people were already in, he didn't do it. Eventually he spread to the whole army. Now you might ask, what about the British? Well, smallpox had overcome Britain a generation earlier. So all those British soldiers that came over were already inoculated. They were immune to smallpox. It was just George Washington's army. And so eventually he got all of his recruits inoculated in that way. And they say that was probably when that started happening, that was the first time that the American army could fight on its own, so to speak, and hold its own against the British. And he did it all without any advice from the CDC. That was very, very important.
She wasn't there?
No, Dr. Fauci wasn't there. I stayed away from Dr. Fauci. I didn't want to get controversial. Anyway, the practice spread and all of them happy. Now, here's another trivia question for you. Who knows who Henry Knox is? Has anybody ever heard of Henry Knox?
Like Fort Knox?
No, K-N-O-X. You're getting closer now, because he turned out to be later on the treasurer of the United States, the national treasurer. But back then, he was a bookseller from Boston. I'm reading my card here. He was 25 years old, and he approached George Washington with a very interesting proposal. He said that Washington, who, by the way, was stuck in the Boston Harbor and the Dorchester Heights, blockaded by the British, couldn't leave. And so Knox went to George Washington and said, you know, there's a fort in upstate New York named Fort Ticonderoga. And these two guys, a guy named Ethan Allen and his not so good friend Benedict Arnold, just took the fort in the middle of the night, no violence or anything. But there's about 60 cannon up there. And I think we should go and get that cannon and bring it to Boston. And take care of the British once and for all. And then he said the golden words, and I'll pay the bill. And George Washington said, yes. And so to transport 60 tons of artillery, currently housed in Fort Ticonderoga, Mr. Knox had quite a bit of work to do. First of all, he had to make the 300-mile journey on his horse from Boston, which took him about 4 days. And then when he got there, he had to dismantle the guns. That took some time. Then he had to arrange for 40 special sleds. Each sled weighed about 5,400 pounds each. And he also purchased 80 yoke of oxen to tow everything. All told, he would transport 43 heavy brass and iron cannon, 8 mortars, 2 howitzers, and maybe you know this, Garrett. I never knew this, 6 cohorns. That's a small, lightweight mortar. So by December 9th, Mr. Knox has everything ready. He's got all the artillery unloaded on flat-bottom boats, and he heads down Lake George. And just in time, because Lake George started to freeze over back then, got to the other side of Lake George, and then a little problem. Put all the cannon on the sleds, and you're going to find this difficult to believe, but there was no snow, not an inch. He had no way to pull the sleds. So he wasted time. It took him 2 weeks. And guess what happens in the North Country? He woke up Christmas morning, and there was 2 feet of snow on the ground. So now he was in business. So he sent a note to George Washington on December 17th. He said, I'll be there in about less than 3 weeks. Of course, he had a slight problem with the snow. He waited a little while, but then he finally got everything loaded. Then when he got to the Hudson River, that was the opposite problem. It wasn't quite frozen over, and he had to get his cannon across. He lost 2 in the Hudson River. But Albany back then, believe it or not, Albany, New York, was a hotbed of rebel activity, patriot activity. And so they helped him fish these cannon out of the river. And on he went. And finally he got to Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts on January 24th, 1776. Now that's not the whole story though. George Washington was a very clever fellow. So what he did is he distracted the British in one part of the heights, and while they weren't looking, he put all of his men on installing those cannons on the heights. Okay. And it was very impressive. In fact, when General Howe got up the next morning, he said, and I'm quoting, "The rebels did more in one night than my whole army would have done in 1 month." I mean, Washington had the cannons all over. He took logs and pinned them like cannons and put them up there too. General Howe was so intimidated by the presence of the cannons that he bugged out. He literally left, took most of the Tories with him, and George Washington won that Battle of Boston, if you so to speak, without firing a shot. But what nobody knows, when I found out in the presentation, George Washington was a little short on gunpowder, very short on gunpowder. In fact, he had enough gunpowder to fire 2 cannons once. And of course, the logs didn't fire at all. I didn't know that. I thought that was amazing, and I come to the conclusion that George Washington would have been a great poker player. Now, Christine's got a little chart back there, and she's going to hand this out, and I'm going to tell you about the turtle. Have any of you ever heard about the turtle? The turtle looks like a turtle. It looks like 2 turtle shells put together. But it is actually the first submarine used in war back in the Revolutionary War. It's the first combat submarine built in 1776 by a guy named Bushnell. Okay, and she's going to pass the picture around so you can take a look at it. Now, this sub was cleverly designed. It was used water for ballast. It had a screw propeller, so the guy inside would crank and the propeller would go. It had a breathing device inside. There was an explosive device that would actually go off underwater. And you could attach the explosive device to the underside of an enemy ship by screwing it in, okay? And it was designed to break the British blockade of Boston Harbor before they finally did it. And they decided to try it on September 7th, 1776. And Bushnell had a brother who trained, worked with him, and he was very good with the turtle. He could do that thing anyway, attach the explosives to just about anything. Unfortunately, and they had General Howe over there from, General Putnam from the Bunker Hill Battle, the fame, he was very famous from that. They had them watching, and they decided to launch this attack of the turtle. They were going to go after a great big British ship called the Eagle, big thing, 64 tons. Unfortunately, the day before the turtle was set to attack, doesn't Bushnell's brother get deathly ill? Okay, sicker than a dog. So they recruit this poor guy, a sergeant from somewhere, Boston, I think it was, Massachusetts. And they said, "You're it." So they put him in the turtle, and they wait. And he gets in the turtle, and he manages to navigate his way under the big British warship, the Eagle. Unfortunately, when he goes to screw the explosive in, he happened to be at the wrong end of the ship, because right next to the rudder of the ship, there's a steel plate, and that's where he was. He couldn't screw it into a steel plate. If he'd picked any other part of the boat, all he had to do was go through some copper sheeting before he had wood, and he attach it. So he tried and tried and tried, and he couldn't get the explosive screwed in there. And so eventually he dropped the explosive, okay, and went back to shore. Okay, and about 20 minutes later, this thing goes off in the water, there's a big spout of water, everybody in the British ship goes apoplectic, nobody gets hurt, there's no damage, okay, because it's way in the bottom of the harbor. And the mission fails. And what's interesting is that they tried this thing, the turtle, 2 more times, and both times it failed because of navigational issues, high tides or rough tides, something like that. And about a month later, it was being transported by the Americans from one destination to another, and didn't that ship get shot down or sunk by the British? What you may not know is that if you want to see the turtle, there is an precise replica of the turtle in Rhode Island at the Naval War Museum. It works. I don't think you can ride on it, but if you want to see it, it's there. It's real, and it actually works. They rebuilt it based on the drawing. And you'll see in those pictures, I think there's some drawings in there. Mr. Bushnell was very precise in his work, and so they've been able to create that. So, anyway, that was the story of the unsuccessful turtle. Who has a $10 bill? No, you don't have to give it. I'm sure some of you know whose face is on the $10 bill. Anybody remember? It's not mine.
Hamilton?
Yes. Yep. Alexander Hamilton. You get an A+.
And $10.
Right. $10. Remember that name, would you please? Okay. This is a story about a dog, a fox terrier named Lila, or Lila, L-I-L-A. His owner was none other than British General William Howe. Well, when the Americans launched a surprise attack on the British in Germantown, which is by the way in the book, back in October 6, 1777, Howe immediately rode out to the battlefield. And along came his trusty fox terrier, Howe. And, or terrier rather. And unfortunately, there was a lot of smoke, a lot of cannon fire, a lot of musket fire, things are confusing. And when everybody split up, the Americans were doing what's called an orderly retreat. The British were just leaving. The dog got confused and he followed the Americans home rather than his master, the British general. Now later on, the next morning, there was an American soldier going through the battlefield trying to pick up unused weapons or weapons that were still useful, so on and so forth. And he spots this dog, takes one look at the collar, and immediately brings the dog back to the camp and presents the dog to George Washington. Washington looks at the collar and realizes this dog belongs to none other than his nemesis, British General William Howe. So Washington sends a letter to the British general. I know what's in the letter. General Washington's compliments to General Howe. Does himself the pleasure to return to him a dog which accidentally fell into his hands and by the inscription on the collar appears to belong to General Howe. And with that, George Washington returned the dog. Now you have to know, George Washington was a big dog fan. He owned about a dozen coonhounds. He liked to hunt for raccoons. And so he loved dogs, and that's one of the reasons he did it. But these two guys are fighting to the death when he returns the dog. Now, you can find, if you think this is fake news, it isn't. You can find the original note with those words on it in George Washington's papers at the Libraries of Congress. And experts have analyzed the writing on the note, and they know for certain that it was written by George Washington's aide-de-camp, who was
Alexander
Hamilton. Yeah. And it's right there in Washington, you can find it. So that's my dog story for today. My next story is favorite. Oh, by the way, Christine, you might want to pass around a little sign-up sheet. If you want to surrender your email address, I have a drawing about every 3 months for a $100 gift card to Amazon. The next one is the 4th of July. Somebody's got to win it, so put your email address in there, and not only will you get a chance to win some money, but you'll get a complimentary subscription to my newsletter, and I'll keep you up to date on my books and all the stuff that I'm doing, and I'm speaking, and so on and so forth. Anyway, my next story is my favorite, as you can tell. I like food. This is about a gingerbread maker, okay? And his name was Christopher Lubick, and he came to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from Germany back in 1754. And he brought with him a large supply of gingerbread molds, cake pans, forms, and lots of recipes. And he was very, very successful. He made bread and cookies. And people would come from far and wide to get his bread and cookies. And he was very, very successful. He owned by the time the war started, he owned 9 houses. He had a farm, 150 acres out in the country, had a very substantial bank account. But he was also a patriot. Okay? And so he volunteered with the local militia in the Revolutionary Army. And he wouldn't accept any money, but he wanted to help them out. So he volunteered to work. Unfortunately, he picked a regiment, or actually a company, that wasn't this patriotic. And they were kind of upset because they hardly ever got rations. And when they did get rations, they were rotten or spoiled. And they threatened to go AWOL. Well, Mr. Ludwig, he said, no, you can't go AWOL. I'll find you something to eat. I'll make you some bread. I'll make you some cookies. And so he did. And they stayed with the company. Well, the next thing you know, the regiment found out about it. And Ludwig was making bread and cookies for them, mostly bread. And then the next door regiment found out about it. And before you know it, he was supplying half the army. George Washington heard about it. Washington was so pleased. By the way, he was doing this all for free. Didn't charge the army or a soldier a nickel. George Washington found out about it. And he said, I'm going to do something about this. So back in May 3rd, 1777, you can look this up, the Continental Congress appointed Mr. Ludwig as the Baker General of the United States Army. And they offered him money. They said, and we'll give you money, and we'll give you 100 pounds of flour for every 100 pounds of bread you've made. He turned down the money, and he said, I'm not going to give you 100 pounds of bread for every 100 pounds of flour you give me, because who can cook bread? You add water to the flour, right? So you actually get more pounds of bread for every pound of flour. So if 100 pounds of flour, you might get 115 pounds of bread. Anyway, long story longer. So over the years, he developed this far-reaching distribution system. He was quite organized, very well respected. He eliminated the corruption in the the food distribution system we had back then, which also crippled the Army, not unlike smallpox. And next thing you know, soldiers all across the East Coast working with George Washington were getting fed in a timely manner and getting fed good food. It made a big difference in the battle. Sadly, this is the rest of the story. When the war ended, most of Ludwig's properties had been stolen and destroyed. He was broke, dead broke. And he's forced to go back to his friend George Washington and ask for some financial help. Washington's recommendation to Congress was that they give him some money. They gave him $200, which wasn't a lot of money back then, for his trouble, a very paltry sum. But he went back to work, making bread, making cookies. And he rebuilt his fortune. And when he died back in 1801, he left $13,000 behind. And he specified that, you go like this, my fellow teachers, he left $13,000 to a charity which would help poor kids in Philadelphia get an education. And here's the rest of the story. That charity still exists today. If you go to Philadelphia, there's something called the Christopher Ludwig Foundation. It now has a trust in excess of $5 million, and it awards about $200,000 in scholarships to needy kids from Philadelphia, and they do it every year.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's my heartwarming story. And I like it too because it's about food. My next story is about a fellow you know, Benedict Arnold. As you know, he was a trader, and this war starts in the Revolutionary War period, but it ends much later. In the fall of 1780, Arnold decided to abandon the Continental Army. He joined up with the British, as you all know. He got 20,000 pounds for his act of traitorship, for conspiring against us. Back then, by the way, it was worth on many battles. Wow. His defenders would say that, he got treated poorly, he'd been wounded twice, one leg was 2 inches shorter than the other one, he'd been passed over for a bunch of promotions. Whatever his motives were, he abandoned the Patriot Army. Now, there was somebody very angry about his betrayal. That was George Washington. And George Washington wanted him back, bad. In fact, he told one of his generals, I want to make an example of him. Don't kill him, I want to make an example of him. And so he reached out to one of his favorite generals, a guy named Henry Lee. He was in charge of a cavalry unit. And he told Henry Lee, I want Benedict Arnold taken alive. My aim is to make a public example of him. And Lee, in turn, tapped a sergeant major of his, a guy named John Champ. Big guy, known for his no-nonsense demeanor. And they came up with a plan, because it turned out Henry Lee's cavalry unit was right on one side of the Hudson, and Benedict Arnold's headquarters was on the other side of the Hudson, just a little bit further apart than that. So they came up with a plan that Champ would pretend to go AWOL himself in his own American Army unit. He would jump in the river, try to catch a ride on all the British ships going back and forth, and try to worm his way into Benedict Arnold's camp. And so they launched the plan. Champ left. His fellow soldiers reported him to General Lee. Lee pretended to be shocked, but he stalled and delayed. And he gave Champ a chance to get away. And Champ did get on the ship. And he talked to the captain of the ship, and he said, I just betrayed the American Army, but there's a lot of us out there. And we think Benedict Arnold is a hero. And we want to be just like Benedict Arnold. Well, the captain of the ship was so impressed. He said, I know Benedict Arnold. Would you like to meet him? And Champ said, well, sure, I'd like to meet him. So he introduces him to Benedict Arnold. Now, this Champ guy was pretty well spoken, and he was very impressive. And Benedict Arnold was so impressed with him. And then he made him a sergeant and said, from now on, you're in charge of recruiting traitors. Now, and this is true, it's true story. So Champ studies, he's in Benedict Arnold's camp, studies Arnold, he waits 2 weeks. Arnold was in the habit of taking a long walk in his riverside garden, the path, all by himself. Now this guy he's 40 years old, wasn't a healthy man. Champ was a big guy. He said, I can take him in the garden. I'll gag him, bound him, and if somebody stops me on the way back, I'll just tell him it's a drunk and bring him to jail. So he reports this back to General Lee, says, this is my plan. General Lee says, great, do it, whatever. The day before Champ decides to do his attack, doesn't Benedict Arnold decide to move his headquarters? Picks up, lock, stock, and barrel, and moves. Now Champ is with the British Army, even though he's a loyal American. He's stuck there. So for 2 weeks, he stays with the British Army, actually fights Americans while he's in the British Army, so to speak. Finally works his way back to General Lee, and they say, well, we came close, but Didn't happen. Now, fast forward a few years later. Champ is a bit of a hero, but General Lee is really upset by this, and I failed, so on and so forth. So the war is now over. There's a big thunderstorm out, and former General Lee's in his house with his 7 kids, and he hears a knock at the door. And he goes to the door, and there's this guy there with a British accent named Cameron. Turns out Cameron was in the war too, on the opposite side, the British side. Well, the war's long over, 2 war guys get together. They spend the whole night drinking and telling each other war stories. And at some point, General Lee tells Cameron, well, I almost got Benedict Arnold, that awful traitor. And he didn't know it at the time, but Champ kept a really detailed diary. So when Champ got back to England, where he was from originally, he decided to write this story up. Nobody really noticed it. Nothing happened. Well, years later, General Lee's in the poorhouse, probably because he had 7 kids. And he decides to write his memoirs. Okay, and he writes about how he almost captured Benedict Arnold. Great story. Doesn't go anywhere. Nobody seems to want to pay any attention. And that's the way that story sits. It's a fantastic story, a lot of drama in it. Nothing happens until years later, General Lee's son decides to publish his father's memoirs. And then those memoirs take off. They're a bestseller, and everybody finds out about how Benedict Arnold almost got captured by the Americans. By the way, General Henry Lee's son was a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee, general in the Civil War. So, anyway, so that's my formal remarks for tonight. I do want to say I bought some books in case you guys are recklessly dangerous with your money and you want to buy some books. But I do want to give a plug for the next book, which comes out in a little while, as I mentioned. It's about the Battle of Plattsburgh. It's about a girl named Charlotte, who was a tomboy named Charlie. And she manages to get on Commodore McDonough's flagship, the Saratoga, and she ends up fighting right there in Plattsburgh. And by the way, that's not crazy, because Commodore McDonough did have a woman on the ship. She was the wife of the cook. And that was not unheard of. There were women that served on ships back then. I'm about 55,000 words into the book, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So I hope it will be out by the end of this year, as a matter of fact, September through December. So if you've seen it, about it, check it out. Let me know what you think about it. I'd be glad to answer your questions. You can think of some questions while I'm saying thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it. You can ask me questions I can't answer, okay?
Why not? You asked us questions.
That's only fair, right?
That was very interesting.
Thank you. You know, I was down in Florida. I've been down in Florida for 6 years, and I do this presentation lots of times, you probably tell. And every now and then, usually an old veteran will put his hand up, and he knows the answers to the questions. I mean, I even one guy knew about the turtle, which I couldn't believe.
I had read something about that a while ago.
Yeah, there was another submarine you probably read during the Civil War, and that was in my Civil War one called the Hunter? No, I forgot it already, isn't that awful? There was, the Huntley. The Huntley was a submarine used in the Civil War, again unsuccessfully. And I don't think anybody knew about that. I was speaking to the, I think, Military Officers Association down in Central Florida. And I asked that question, who's heard of the Huntley? This guy just gets up in the middle of my address and leaves. And he comes back and he's got a classic model of the Huntley. He knew all about it. He was an expert on the Huntley. And he told me to buy a model, which I did. I can't read the writing. The parts are too small, so it's still sitting in my office. Anybody wants a model of the Huntley, let me know. I'll send them a free one. But it's amazing. And then, of course, another time I was speaking, I think it was in Okeechobee. There was a library. I didn't expect very many people. 53 people showed up. And this one little old lady way in the back kept looking at me, kind of funny. I watched the audience. And at the end of my speech, she scolded me because I kept referring to the Civil War as the Civil War. And she said, down here, we refer to it as the War of Northern Aggression. So I'm not sure what to do anymore. But I sold a lot of books. Whatever. Can I tell you anything else? Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So thank you, Janet.
Yeah,
once again, Authors Nights here are getting to be old hat with you and me.
Yeah.
I'll keep writing if you keep hosting. How's that?
Absolutely.
Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Have you been to the Revolutionary Museum in Philadelphia?
Not yet. Christine took me on 2 trips of a lifetime. She took me to Gettysburg, and then most recently we went to Williamsburg. And right next door to Williamsburg is Yorktown. And we lucked out. We got an Uber driver that for a $20 bill brought me all over the place.
Awesome.
And did a lot of original research for this book, as a matter of fact, in Yorktown there. This book actually doesn't go to the end of the Revolutionary War. It stops at
Germantown.
Germantown, I think. Yeah. I was just telling Calvin, by the way, that my son-in-law, for whom this book is written, just finished reading the book. He's had it for months now. Calvin's 2/3 of the way through his copy.
I'm a father now, Mark.
That's the excuse you can use for viewers.
These books are
Yeah.
signed, by the way, and I talked to Eric. He said he would sign the book too if you wanted to.
I was
Absolutely no fee.
Oh.
No fee.
So that'll wrap it up. We've been at the Champlain Meeting House on Main Street, Route 9 in beautiful downtown Champlain in the village. This is a place owned by, as she said, by Janet McFetridge. She and her late husband, Clark Herdick, refurbished this place and have used it to let the community gather and enjoy each other's company and enjoy music and other speakers here at the Champlain Meeting House. So you've been watching Mark Barie and his discussion on his book, Sister Marguerite and the Captain.